Can a machine create art? Because it's not a hypothetical question anymore. Right now, AI is generating images, writing novels, composing symphonies, and honestly, some of it is breathtaking. This is Sam, and welcome back to another episode of Data Science with Sam. Today, I'm sitting down with Andres Morales, who's been thinking deeply about this topic, someone who's been at the intersection of technology and creativity, watching this transformation unfold in real time. Andres is a creative technologist and founder of Red Mage, bringing over 9 years of experience in web design, automation, and integration services, primarily serving nonprofits, creative professionals, and systematically underrepresented communities. He's a passionate advocate for equitable technology, recently sponsoring ArtGuard, a platform protecting artists' work from unauthorized AI training. And also, he's leading initiatives like ArtMix, AI and Creative Arts Exhibit, and the No Prompt Needed series in Fort Collins. He's also leading the Fort Collins AI for Everyone subgroup, which is a subgroup of Rocky Mountain AI Interest Group, a C3 nonprofit organization focused on generative AI education in Colorado. In his personal time, he practices counted thread embroidery and enjoys cultural experiences like the theatrical productions, Headstone and Frankenstein 2025. Andres, welcome to the show. I'm really happy to have you here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, for sure, Sam. I'm really excited to be here. If you can't tell, it's kind of a passion topic, both personally and professionally. So I'm really excited to get into it.
Thanks, Andres. To all our listeners, grab your coffee because we're diving into one of the most important conversations happening right now. Let's get into it. So let's start with the first question. So Andres, 2 years ago, most people had never heard of generative AI. Now they got to use the tools that can create photorealistic images, write novels, compose music, all in like a few seconds. So in your opinion, how has generative AI fundamentally changed the creative landscape in the past 2 years? And honestly, what has surprised you most about its adoption in creative industries?
Yeah, so it's been interesting since that weird summer, I want to say, of 2023 when ChatGPT came out. You've seen a really rapid emergence of a lot of software as a service tools. With my work being a lot on a platform called Contra, I've been invited to try out tools like Lovable or LoveArt, I should say, not Lovable. That's a separate AI tool. Yeah, Flora, Ideogram. They might be using a whole bunch of different models now. I think when we first started, there was really like a small handful of vision models like Stable Diffusion and things like that were creating these things. And then all of a sudden it just started proliferating. Now all of a sudden there's so many more models.
Mm-hmm.
What I found really interesting is the ease of producing something that's good enough, and where I think that kind of comes into play is, with a short natural language prompt, all of a sudden you can create some output that is, somewhat convincing, whether that's convincing for the purposes of advertisements or convincing for something else. And, there's no guardrails, there's no verification, there's nobody going and saying with like systematically that these things are true. And that kind of both surprises me and scares me. There was an example that I saw recently of a user who generated body cam footage with, Sora 2. There's some fun things like maybe they're making CCTV footage of Sam Altman stealing GPUs from Target because to keep the lights on in OpenAI. That's kind of funny. But, it brings up a question of like, why are people allowed to generate body cam footage? Why are people allowed to generate CCTV footage? I'm also finding that the threshold for good enough is a lot shorter than I thought it was. You see a lot of people, especially with like free or very low paying models of ChatGPT, they will generate some sort of advertisement, some sort of graphic, and you'll see all the wonky fonts, all the weird text, all the distorted faces, and they'll just publish it. Like there was a magazine here in town in Fort Collins that published that. And the only response I got was really like, we can't tell businesses how to advertise themselves. as long as it's within our guidelines, it's totally up to them, which is, kind of a cop out answer, but it's kind of true. So really with me, the thing that's been most surprising is how willing people are to utilize these tools and kind of create their own perception of reality, so to speak, if that all makes sense.
Yeah, totally makes sense because AI transformation definitely fascinating because I think a lot of us we know that there is a truly intuitive power that AI holds that can bring a lot of creative work. I think the main issue is like the speed of adoption. I feel like that kind of like caught everyone else a little off guarded, right?
Hmm.
We didn't anticipate that the Sam, there will be some sort of a generative hours coming up where you can see like someone look like Sam Altman trying to steal a GPUs from a store. Like that's kind of body cam images. I just feel like people are being creative, but sometimes they're also not thinking intuitively that their creativity could potentially impact some sort of a guardrails and compliance. And I just feel like some organization are kind of allowing that to do so. So I think that's where this discussion is so important to understand where you can actually think realistically, that where you can put the guardrails versus where you can still let the AI creativity flourishes. So I believe
Hmm.
kind of like you were trying to like you mentioned, and we will definitely get into that more in the later section of this episode. Now, having said that, I'm going to move on to the next one since you mentioned about AI creativity and stuff. The one of the main, I guess, the sensitive area is the copyright battleground.
Hmm.
So let's
Yeah.
tackle that. Like I would say that's kind of like an elephant in the room right now because that's one of the biggest thing in the creativity world. Like we're seeing lawsuits from artists to writers, photographers against AI companies. They also have a lot of claims about it seems like AI has been manipulating their work or they're using something that they shouldn't be doing, at least in the creative world. So those models were, it seems like they're trained on some of the copyrighted work done by human professionals. And sometimes they've been using it without permission, without compensation. I mean, Disney already got a lot of lawsuits. So I want to
Mhm.
know where do you stand on this, Andres? Should AI companies be required to compensate creators whose work trained on this model? Or is this similar to how human artists learn by studying the masters? So where should we bring that balance here?
So definitively 100% believe that we should be compensating creators for their usage in AI models. If it's not public domain, genuinely, it feels to me like you're taking advantage of the content that's already there, right? Because the conversations aren't just, hey, we're training these models. It's companies like Meta, OpenAI are grabbing all this information and they're grabbing it through means that doesn't make sense, right? Like from a legal standpoint or from a copyright standpoint. I find that a lot of the conversation boils down to this kind of weird dichotomy. It's something that comes up a lot in the conversations that I have about AI and creativity, where people value the product or the end result that artists produce, but they can kind of care less about the person behind the art, which, a lot of creatives will tell you the person behind the art is the most important part, right? There's so much lived experience. There's so much, like there's so much that goes into the pieces that they make. Like when there's some sort of like it's hard to describe. Like genuinely, the dichotomy is just people really wanting to get the accolades and all that good stuff of being a creative, of being like, look, my art is in the Museum of Modern Art. My art is in this gallery. The money and the fame and stuff, without necessarily getting to the actual like labor and effort and the process behind all that art. And it's really interesting because it kind of makes it feel like art is kind of like locked behind a door. You hear this conversation a lot about, democratization and all that. And really, there's the perception of success in the context of creativity and the actual result of what success looks like in creativity are really different because I think a lot of people, when they think of art and successful, they think of like that guy who like taped a banana on the wall and made like $1 million off of taping that banana off the wall, right? Or whatever, how much money he made. When in all reality, you have countless creatives who are wildly successful. Like they are well-known creatives in the communities that they serve, and they aren't sitting here making $1 million. Chances are most of them aren't, right? It's just interesting to see how much people value the end product without understanding what goes into making said end.
No, that's very I guess that's kind of like brings me to that one of the question that kind of like struggles me all the time is it's kind of like some sort of an argument that going on the related topic. Like
Mm-hmm.
people are trying to make that assumption, or they're trying to make an argument to like remarks that, let's say a human learns from Picasso. They're not mechanically reproducing elements. They're just interpreting, filtering through their own consciousness, which kind of like mimic probably the art that Picasso already did. However,
Mm-hmm.
these AI models, if they're trying to do the same thing, they're going to do it utilizing a statistical pattern matching at scale that could mimic
Right.
the pattern of the Picasso art. Now, in that case, how do we make some sort of an argument to rationalize that distinction matters? Or is it something like we are kind of like splitting hairs at this moment and thinking too drastically? So how do you think that how we can make that proper rationalization to an
Mm-hmm.
AI professional or as AI CEO that no, even though AI is making us kind of like a systematical pattern or statistical pattern to generate some R's, it's still kind of breaking the barrier or just breaking some rules in terms of generating R's. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's worth delineating and distincting the difference between different tiers of artists, so to speak, right? And different tiers of creatives. Because I think somebody who is working in a creative team for something like Coca Cola or Warner Brothers is very different than a local artist here in like Colorado, right? And very different than someone who's just practicing this from a hobby perspective. Generally speaking, with the idea of condensing all of this art and turning it out with a statistical model, I would really invite people to look at the different perspectives online and how much people react to the back and like the backlash associated with utilizing these tools, right? And I think it's worth noting in the context of that, like I'm not seeing creatives in my spaces and stuff talk about how they want to incorporate AI into their workflow, right? I think that's a really important distinction. More often than not, when people are talking about AI, they're usually talking about how they can support themselves in order to continue doing their art, right? You know, that very poignant quote that's like, I was expecting AI to do the dishes and fold the laundry so that I can go and do the fun stuff. Instead, it's doing the fun stuff. And now I'm doing all the dishes and laundry, right? Generally speaking, just feels like the usage of the technology is not in the best interest of the artists. Generally speaking, I see a lot of these design tools, these softwares as a service, these sorts of models. More often than not, they're marketing towards enterprises. They're not marketing towards like an individual being like, hey, here's a design agency, here's like, you know, a small business who's trying to just get by. Like usually they're like, hey, we work with you know, Lionsgate, we work with Warner Brothers, we work with all these big names in movies and videos and technology. And it's like, okay, cool. You see a lot of the same in video game industries as well, where there's a very big difference between how the executives and the big like is perceiving and utilizing this technology versus people downstream. You know, you to kind of cap it off with like a poignant example, we're working on that No Prompt Needed series in Fort Collins. One of our organizers shared the post. The entire point of the event is to protect and empower creatives in the era of AI. Just because there was that word AI there in the poster, you know, somebody went on the comments and was like, "Oh, I can't believe you're getting involved with this type of event. I can't believe you're an AI shill." And it's like, okay, the event, you know, regardless of whether the sentence is AI should not be in creative spaces, just the mention of the word AI is a concern. So there's a lot of emotion in the situation. There's a lot of concern, and I think it's worth splitting and delineating the conversation based off of who in the creative spaces is bringing up the conversation instead of just, you know, going and you know, putting everybody in one box. Because, you know, as you know, in a lot of different contexts, there's no single group that's like a monolith. We're all different in how we're approaching that.
I think you're totally right. I mean, like you mentioned about some of the big media agencies utilizing AI to generate arts and stuff that they can use for
Mhm.
purpose or like making a commercial arts. Maybe in that case, we will still see a usefulness of AI where they are spending less time and they can generate more commercial ads that they could do. But we also need to think about how we can safeguard our human artists and we can serve their best interest as well. Otherwise, we will see some sort of an emotional outburst that you just mentioned, like
Hmm.
just seeing the AI word in certain events, people are just getting kind of like, taking it emotional and they're just having that outburst of why we're using that in the creative space. And that kind of like brings me to the next thing. It's kind of tied to the human emotion because human emotion ties to authenticity and value. So
Hmm.
just that brings me to my next question is that when AI can generate a beautiful piece of art or a compelling story in seconds, something that might take a human hours, days, and maybe years, how do we define and value authentic creativity in that case? I mean, how can we draw the line, making sure that, the both um, parties, preserve their uniqueness and as well as we can still embrace innovation? And I know it's a very difficult question to answer,
Hmm.
but I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, for sure. I think again, it's worth separating those like big industry versus like individual artists and small businesses. Because the individual, like the big companies, like they're still going to use it, right? Like Coca-Cola got a lot of backlash from last year's ad about using AI for Christmas. And they went like, oh, okay, our bad. And then they came back and did the same thing this year. So, they're still going to use it because they're still interested in cutting corners cost as much as possible. On the other side of things, the individual side, I can't necessarily speak to the particulars of like running a successful art business because most of my artistic ability is in kind of hobby work. So like I've got a couple of examples right here. So like this is the embroidery project that I'm working on right now. Unfortunately, I cannot pawn this off to ChatGPT in any meaningful capacity. It's embroidery. I can't do that, right?
And you can with some sort of an imagination that can create a constructible prompt
Right.
and pass it to ChatGPT.
People have tried to do like cross stitch and stuff and try to automate that process. They can get some embroidery done, but cross stitch specifically, there's a lot of mechanical movement that goes in and around the fabric. Um, and that kind of brings me to my perspective where like the process is the whole point of creation. And I think oddly enough, an example that comes to mind is really like software engineering and tech in general, right? Um, to a certain extent, the process matters much more than the end result. Like, how do we actually approach the problem? An example might be like financial tech. Would you trust a company that went through the process and made sure that all of their credit card processing is safe and established to strict standards? Or, if I said, hey, I started a fintech startup this past weekend, I built this vibe coded application in a weekend. Don't you want to give me your credit card information? Like from a tech perspective, there's one of these situations that is much more trustworthy than the other, right? I see that a lot in this in art as well, right? A lot of people are pivoting towards what I like to call authenticity, ownership, and accountability in the context of like what they do. They care a lot more about the process. I found that online, based off of my research, more clients are asking about like work in progress, like snippets. Maybe it's like somebody actively drawing the product or layers or something to show that somebody is actually creating the product and not just going and putting it through a model. Ownership, clear attribution, and creator rights. People are getting a lot more in tune with doing that online, and accountability, mostly like in the context of technology, even it's just like, where is my data going in this product? Where is my data going? How are you utilizing all of this in the context of what we're working on? And, more importantly, what happens when something goes wrong, right? From a creative perspective, that might be, hey, there was a misunderstanding between what you wanted me to build and what you told me you wanted to, right? Never happens in software, right? Like that requirements gathering maybe wasn't exact. You see a lot of the same thing in tech, where, people are more interested in the how, really, and how we got to that point and what it rather than necessarily the what, because the what is starting to become a commodity, right? Like the AI generated, like you've seen Nano Banana, like the Pro model that just came out a short while ago. It can do some insanely like detailed and decently looking like graphics, right? So how does that actually translate? Well, people are more interested in the how. Like if anybody can go and create a graphic like that, they're more interested in the person behind the graphic, if that all makes sense.
That's totally makes sense. And I feel like to kind of restore authenticity and also kind of restore trust in those AI generated creative arts, doesn't matter who creates that, whether it's a big conglomerate or even like a small AI startup company, they need to find out a way to provide a rational or kind of like they have to disclose the process of the generation. Like
Mhm.
that those kind of AI creative arts needs to also go through some audit and compliance protocol, like similar to what you have seen in other industries like finance. If you go there, I mean, they get audited by a lot of things. And I feel like the way
Yes.
things have been going is like the AI generated arts could also be a sensitive matter that had to be closely scrutinized or audited even before it goes into production or even if it goes public. And it's kind of hard for a small companies to have that kind of audit guardrails, but that's like a liable,
Yes.
like an additional expense for them. But the big conglomerates, like companies like Coca-Cola and all those media marketing agencies, could definitely set up some sort of a pipeline that could help people to bring, like have some trust on the process, that it's not like that it's generating something totally out of a black box. There's a human in the loop in the process. They're defining the rules and prompts, and using that, the AI is generating something. So it's not like that AI is totally replacing humans in that process. So maybe that
Mhm.
the future, maybe that's how we can bring some balance, just to your point. And I feel like the audit and compliance could potentially be another solution in this AI and creative space, which probably people started thinking about given all the backlash and lawsuits they're seeing, now.
Yes.
Cool. And that's, again, I've already used the term called human replace. That's kind of like, brings me to the next question that
Mhm.
if I flip this around, that what aspects of human creativity do you believe AI fundamentally cannot replicate? I mean, we talked about that some of the stuff AI is taking over, they're generating all this creative arts and stuff, and maybe that's going to impact some jobs. But there are some elements that AI cannot replace, and we still have to keep human in the loop. So I wanted to kind of like get your opinions on that, especially for our listeners who are in this space, so they could get some sort of a relief and they could hone on their skills to improve that, so their jobs will still be safeguarded from AI in this space.
Right. With that, I find that there's a lot of, I mentioned lived experiences in the context of like the process of what you're trying to produce, right? To go back to the embroidery piece that I have here, you wouldn't be able to tell just from here, but like this piece represents kind of my experience, my lived experiences in Hawaii. I graduated from high school in Hawaii, right? And so these flowers are all different flowers native to Hawaii. So you've got like, I just finished this bird of paradise, you got some orchids, some hibiscus, some pineapple, and like, that's just like one small example of like how the lived experience matters in the context of what you're producing. There was a really poignant piece put out by the dean of my alma mater, Northern Arizona University. I believe his name is Dr. Jose Luis Cruz Rivera. Fantastic individual. He put out a piece where basically he was trying to figure out from a story perspective how to write in a way that was outside of the norm. So, like when you think of authors, you think of a lot of, frankly, old white men. Like a lot of the authors and stuff, you get a lot of the same perspectives. And when, it's the statistically like most likely of like successful authors, right? As soon as he went and said, great. I don't want to use these perspectives. I want to use perspectives of this Puerto Rican writer that I know and that I really appreciate and is famous in their own right. All of a sudden, all the output changed, right? And you actually had output that was closer to what he was looking for out of that model. And it brought up this very important question. Well, if I didn't know that person existed, would the output have been the same? And so that lived experience is so incredibly important in the context of what you're producing. because then, if you don't know what you don't know, and it will just go and create these biases, almost like not even necessarily. Let me take a step back. The people like to perceive the biases and stuff that come out of AI as something that is like deliberate. Like somebody's putting an if statement in there and being like, if, LinkedIn is actually getting trouble with that right now with, bias and stuff where they're like, women are maybe like an eighth as likely to get as much recognition or, engagement on their posts as men algorithmically. So, it's a very similar thing. I don't necessarily think that LinkedIn in this case is going and saying, if woman, then give less engagement, right? That's not a line of code in their, website. But, it is potentially a concern from a training perspective. Like what training data goes into the, likely they have some sort of machine learning model that represents their algorithm of what is being served to users, right? They might, without people that have those different lived experiences, you would never be able to figure out that it's creating these patterns like this. And I think that with art, it's very similar in the sense that the more lived experiences you have, the more different lived experiences that are being represented through creative works, the better off we're going to be. And that's something that AI fundamentally cannot replicate, that lived experience, because again, people don't know what they don't know. I am not going to go and necessarily be like, I lived in South Korea for 6 years. Am I going to suddenly know all the intricacies of South Korean culture to be able to generate something that's representative of their culture? Not really. Like, that's just not my lived experience. And I would want to see more works and see more creative works from different lived experiences. And that's very hard to do with AI.
No, totally. I mean, that's one thing I definitely agree with you on this one, because at the end of the day, I mean, human cognitive power would still be required, and the lived experience, like you mentioned. As a human, we perceive things in a different way than AI can do. AI is still a statistic machine, and it knows based on the information you were just feeding it into it. And even if it can generate something, but that generate whatever they generate, sometimes it cannot match the reality, because there are so many generative, like this memes and stuff that we're seeing right now, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and if you ask a human to generate similar kind of memes, they're probably going to think twice to generate that, because they know that some of those memes are videos and reels doesn't match.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so an AI can still produce that, and I think that's where the human lived experience is more important, because we tend to generate something that will still gonna be something match the reality, and AI probably gonna keep generating more and more stuff that's more abstract and something that could potentially mislead the, like the society. I think that's where the main
Mm-hmm.
problem is right now, and hopefully, I guess, having human in the loop or keeping human in the loop, hopefully that alleviate the issues. But I think I totally agree with you in the
Yeah.
that in the living experience is something where we still need a human to drive the AI machine to do that generative arts, instead of AI being asking the human, or AI being taking full control of that, because some of the cases it should not be able to do that. And there,
Right. You shouldn't be,
talk about that. Yeah.
yeah, you shouldn't be pawning your agency over to this model, because I've seen people go
Mhm.
and, they will go and, well, I don't know what to build in Bolt, or I don't know what to build or create in Midjourney. So I'm just going to prompt Gemini and start talking to that. And it's like, great, cool. Or the classic thing in every single meeting where it's like, well, ChatGPT said this. And it's like, okay, like for those that are audio only, I'm shrugging. I'm like, okay, cool. Like I can prompt ChatGPT. I can go and ask it this same question. What do you bring to the conversation? I think that's like a very great way of kind of solidifying that, where it's like, you know, what do you bring to the table that is separate from the AI? Because the AI, anybody can prompt, right? But what are you actually doing that's different? And I think lived experience is part of that.
I think the human thought process is really required for that. And it just,
Mhm.
like, if you're asking a software engineer to, okay, you can use a vibe coded app or whatever, but you should be able to review the code, making sure that the code and functions are following a proper logic
Yes.
flows. Because AI could definitely generate thousands of lines of code, but maybe some of them are redundant. You never know. That's why we need probably a software engineer. I'm just using the analogy because there is a concept called vibe coding, which is similar to
Yes.
the software engineering world where we are creating code coming out of an AI box, right? It's kind of a synonymous to creative arts, right? But we still need a software engineer to kind of like just review the code, making sure that this AI is not generating 10 functions, which could have been done in one or two functions,
Hmm.
So I think that's kind of like the where we need a human in the loop. And that kind of like brings me to the next question is because it's more on that how we can collaborate, not thinking of
Right.
competing with the AI. And because I don't think it's all kind of like it's not all like a doom and gloom at this moment. There is a there's a thought process, and that's why we're having this conversation to think about that. It's not like we are heading towards more of a AI generative art. There are conversation going on. So now having said that, what are some inspiring examples you have seen where this partnership is actually elevating human creativity and like the blend of human cognitive like thought process as well as the AI intelligence bringing something that is like an aha moment, right? So do you have any sort of example that you can share with my listeners here so that they can take some positive out of it, and that will also help them think that how they can utilize AI to generate something unique and authentic without thinking about somebody's going to sue them in future.
Right. Part of my thought process goes back to that successful in the context of art being incredibly subjective. And when it comes to like successful use cases of AI and creativity intersecting, uh, I think that somebody on the board of like Coca-Cola or, OpenAI with the movie that they're sponsoring, around being entirely AI generated, they consider those efforts, to be successful because people are engaging with it, even if the engagement is, man, we really don't like this. There's always that term of like, any publicity is good publicity. I don't agree with it, but generally speaking, they're still going and being like, well, people are talking about us, even if the sentence is, I don't like the way they're approaching this problem. One thing, not necessarily generative AI, because I think it's worth separating the two, right? Generative AI versus other types of machine learning and other models. There was actually a ballet troupe or some sort of dance troupe that I met in Boulder that was doing that sort of using machine learning models specifically to create music based off of their dance, which was really, really interesting because then you had someone who was a machine learning professional who was going and training this model to utilize these different sounds based off of sensors on their arm, right? It's really, really interesting because then, they would go and raise their hands or raise their legs or go and move their head or whatever the case may be. And the music would shift with their movement. And it was such an interesting experience. And they proved that it was not just them moving to a predefined musical thing. They had the audience come up and create their own music too with the same sensors. And I found that really interesting because it was a perfect example of like the intersection of what humans do best, which is actually moving and creating these important dances. And man, the athleticism behind stuff like ballet is insane, combined with machine learning in a way that doesn't distract from the humanity of it, right? They are still in control. They are still the ones that are dancing with this technology, but they are the conductor. They are the curator. They are the person who's actually making this all happen. I think it's a very relevant example to just how I feel like AI should be implemented in general, right? You still have the humans doing what they do best, and they are the expert. They are the curator. They are the conductor of the AI train, whether that's the AI hype train or some sort of other train, up for debate. um, but like the entire thing just being with humans at the helm, you mentioned it very importantly about having that human in the loop. I think it's more than just human in the loop. I find that sometimes people are invited to the table, but they aren't necessarily allowed to speak, right? Like, and for me, I think it is more than that. When I see a lot of companies implementing human in the loop, they're like, well, we have a human actually reviewing this AI output. And it's like, I don't think necessarily that's enough. I think in a lot of instances, if the human is not at the forefront of the conversation, maybe there's an opportunity to improve there.
No, I think I would say it's a very thought provoking, and I love the example here, especially like you mentioned that, there is a human involved. They're doing what they're best to do, and they're still kind of like showing their creativity and stuff. How
Mhm.
an AI model and machine learning model at the back end kind of augmenting that. They are doing
Yes.
something out of that human creativity that we could have probably done, but we probably don't have the capacity to do that for so many other issues, even resource
Mhm.
capacity, budget, and all kind of stuff. So I feel like it's a shift in mindset. Like we shouldn't think about what AI can do that human already been doing, rather than what AI can do better that human probably could have done, but they don't have that capacity to do that. So rather, I think it's like preserving the human creativity as well as kind of amplifying it by utilizing or augmenting AI. I think that's where we should head in the direction.
Mhm.
I just feel like sometimes we just kind of interpreting the thing in a different way. Rather, we just have to change our mindset and viewpoints on how we can augment AI with a human creativity rather than thinking about replacing it at all. Obviously, the big conglomerates, big organization, they always trying to cut corners for cutting cost and budget and all kind of stuff. I think that's where we probably need to have like audit compliance and I would say the guidelines and all kind of like guardrails to making sure that we are not moving in the direction where we are literally keeping humans outside of the loop, where they're the one kind of the innovator of the creativity and stuff. I think that's
Mhm.
things we as a society we have to kind of like think about, and that's why I love the way this conversation going, and I'm pretty sure my listeners are also pretty happy to hear your thought point, viewpoints and thought process, Andres. So thanks
Yeah, for sure.
for this continuing conversation. Moving on to like you mentioned the term democratization at the beginning of this episode, so I'm gonna like phrase my next question kind of around the topic. And I'm not trying to get politically low sticky here, but some people are
Mhm.
AI democratizes creativity, makes tool accessible to everyone, levels the playing field. And sometimes and some other people are also saying that it devalues professional creative works, floods the market with mediocrity, as we have been seeing all these memes and reels coming out right now, generated by Sona or Nano Banana Pro or whatever. Which perspective resonates more with you, Andres, or is it the truth somewhere in the missing middle? And is this the future that we are heading into, where we will see that drawing the parallel between messy AI creative work as well as some human creative work are still gonna get unprecedented by them?
Right. Yeah. Democratization is such an interesting term in the context of AI and art. Democratizing art implies that there was something to democratize and that it was locked behind something for you. I think that that perception largely comes from, like I was saying before, the notion that success in art means going and taping a banana to a wall and making $1 million, right? In all reality, success is wildly subjective. And I think that that is where people are coming from when they say AI is democratizing art. From my perspective, genuinely, I feel like there was nothing to democratize in the first place, right? And that's my hot take. You know, the daily act of creation was never locked behind anything for you. That like you can pick up a pencil, like not to use a pencil specifically, but you can grab a kit from the store and learn how to do the craft you're trying to accomplish, right? Will it suck? Almost certainly, right? Like that's just the nature of it. You're going to produce something that isn't particularly good, and that's okay. One of my friends, good friends up here in Fort Collins, actually did that exact thing. He started hearing about different perspectives on AI and creativity. He works at an AI company right now, and genuinely he just went like, okay, cool, well, people say that it's really easy to do, let me just go pick up a knitting kit and see how it goes. And now he is addicted to the craft. He will go and talk about it all the time. He'll go and start doing all these things, and all he did was just pick up the kit and start, right? And I think that also it's worth noting in this situation that there are a lot of people who are very stressed out, right? Stressed out with work, stressed out with life, stressed out where time is spread thin. And by the time they come home from work or whatever obligations they have, they're tired. And like, I want to honor that in the sense that like it's hard to learn and it's hard to grow and it's hard to, conceptualize how to approach these things when you are already at the bottom of your hierarchy of needs. You're worried about whether rent is due. You're worried about whether groceries are able to be afforded. And you're being asked, well, you should just go and learn how to do this new thing. You're already spread thin. Like, that's the other part of it that I think is worth highlighting. That being said, a lot of the creatives that I know in the space are doing creativity and doing art in addition to their full-time job, right? Like, I have my full-time job of doing, art consulting with technology. I'm a part of Rocky Mountain AI. I'm doing all these events. And then I'm also going and doing my embroidery, right? Like, in between that, like, to a certain extent, that's sort of interacting with the medium and creating despite the adversity, creating despite the struggles. It is part of really what makes the struggle real and kind of makes the process of art really rewarding, and the creative process actually produce something that means something to you, because despite all of these things in your way, you're still creating something, right? That's not to say that we should go and normalize the artist struggle, right? And be like, yeah, you need to be a starving artist before you can be successful. I don't agree with that sentiment. But I do believe that the process and being able to create, people will create regardless. I fully believe.
Natural
And
of human being.
and people will create, unfortunately, fortunately, unfortunately, whatever your thoughts are on it, with these models being out there like Nano Banana, Clang, Stable Diffusion, people will create with AI anyways as well, right? Whether or not it's societally acceptable to do so, whether or not it's commercially viable to do so, I think that's a completely different story. And that's a much larger conversation. People will create regardless. And I think that to say that art and creativity is democratized is somewhat, it just feels like it's strange because it was never like locked behind anything in the first place.
I mean, when you're saying that, it's kind of like struck my head. I mean, I was trying to draw an analogy, like, early
Mm-hmm.
2000, social media, networking, online platform came out. People started chatting
Right.
online, like we started interacting. We started letting people, interacting with people who lives probably on the other side of the world, right? But never diminished the idea of, meeting in person. That never diminished the idea of people, mingling. They're meeting up in general. They're growing their network even in the in-person setup. So I feel like that's where probably, we would see in the creative space, where people are still going to utilize AI to generate creative arts, but they're also not gonna suppress their human natural phenomenon of creative arts, by hand or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I guess these two things will go in parallel. And the reason I drew the analogy with the social media networking, because social media, started being a big thing, like starting from like its late, uh, like early 2010s,
Mm-hmm.
book just boomed, but people still never lost in touch of like having that in-person connection and stuff. And also we started seeing that in the early years of COVID, like in 2020 or
Right.
when people started moving online job. But now we can see that people started coming out. They're actually preferring more like in an in-person office setup and a hybrid setup to work, because they are missing that social interaction. So I think similarly, and at some point in time, maybe people might get a little bored with the AI creative work. So people who tends to use AI creative work hours every day, they might shift towards more of conversational, I mean, like I would say more like conventional arts, and then try to utilize that. I feel like these two folds will go in parallel, but the future will decide that which one will take precedence over others. And I think that's kind of like brings me to that final question that, and it's kind of like a big one. I'm not asking you to like, bring it
Mm-hmm.
all and tell me what it looks like, but I really wanted to hear your thought process on that. 5 years from now, let's say around 2030, what does the creative landscape looks like? Are we going to still going in that direction where both these creative flows, human generated and AI generated, will go in parallel, or there will be a scenario where one area will take precedence over others?
Yeah. So it's really hard to say because there's a lot of parallels in terms of how this type of technology is proliferated in other creators, right? You saw this a lot with clothes creating and fiber art. in, creating automated technology. And that's usually where the whole conversation of Luddite comes from, right? People going and burning these machines because they were going and replacing their jobs. There's a lot of parallels to be drawn with generative AI in that context and how that's been approached. Generally speaking, there's one kind of cycle that I'm really a fan of in terms of explaining AI, and that's like the Gartner hype cycle. Kind of details how, technology, you'll have a couple of small adopters. It'll go all the way up to this peak of inflated expectations. And then there will be some sort of thing where people will be like, well, this isn't really that useful because I thought it would do everything and more. And it actually only does very specific things. You see that already with AI, right? Where people are thinking, well, I can just pawn off all my decision making to this thing and it can just do whatever I need it to. Right? Like, why do I need people to be in charge of this if I can just prompt ChatGPT to do this? In all reality, it's a statistical model. It's trying to give you what is statistically likely based off your input, right? What I find, I think, with a lot of this technology is that we're kind of at that peak of inflated expectations where people are very excited about the technology and they really, really want it to be useful and meaningful. And there's a good portion of people who are financially interested in this technology succeeding. In all reality, I feel like it will start to hit that kind of lull pretty soon, I imagine, where people are realizing maybe AI is helpful for some things, but it's not necessarily the end all be all destroyer of everything creative. There's a lot of stuff from the business and technology side to suggest that, AI is both can help with productivity, can help with these things. But, you have studies coming out from like MIT saying that like 95% of projects fail to generate, return on investment. You have people going and saying that, approximately 500 people a day are losing their jobs due to automation, whether that's automation or automation in quotes. They're using some sort of other, using it as an excuse for some other cost cutting measure. Remains to be seen. For me, I find that I would expect a lot more people to care about who made the product rather than how it was made, rather than the product itself. You're already seeing that today. There was a movie that came out, Heretic, I believe. It was an A24 film. Specifically in the credits, it said no generative AI was used in the making of this film. And that's huge from the perspective of like a consumer, because people are going and lauding this company for going and saying like, hey, we didn't use AI. I think you're going to find in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, that generative AI will kind of there will be genuine use cases of where this stuff can be helpful. But more people are going to start gravitating towards human-made things, more, like personable experiences, more live experiences that they know is real. The more that things are starting to become unreal online, you have the like generated CCTV footage, body cam footage, natural disasters, that there were people going and generating content of hurricanes and things like that from perspectives that don't exist, right? You trying to take a video from space essentially in an airplane where they can't get that high, right? All that to say, to kind of wrap it up in a nice little bow, I think you're both going to see people that are still going to be using the technology for these types of creative endeavors. That's not going to change. I think the societal perspective on it will change. And I think there will be a greater emphasis on human-made labels. There will be whether or not that's more on the lines of greenwashing and a lot of what we've seen where people just slap organic on something and they're like, great, like, it's human-made. Like, that remains to be seen as well. I think fully there will be a lot of perspectives like that as well. But a lot of it is just going to be kind of a course correction in terms of where we utilize this technology in a meaningful way. What that exactly will look like is, up in the air. But I do think that there's going to be a big resurgence of human-made labels and big resurgence on people figuring out how to keep the reality in something that is otherwise generative.
It seems like you are cautiously optimistic, and I do see that your viewpoints over here definitely could match the reality, because at some point of time we might just get bored with seeing all this AI generated creative arts, and we probably gonna start seeing pattern there, because at the end of the day there's still a statistical pattern. They're still generated based on a probability distribution and stuff. when it comes to, generating something, when it comes to building something from the scratch, we still have to need a human creator to kind of like, lay their hands on.
Mhm.
So I totally agree with you. And I would tell my listeners, like, yes, you are going to use AI generated art somewhere. Your process will touch at some point of time, that's going to utilize AI generated art. But also be mindful about where you are drawing the line, where you are utilizing a human creative arts over an AI generated art. So you have to define that. And I think it's kind of I would say, a moral responsibility. Like, we are morally obligated to understand that distinction, making sure that the creative arts generated by human or AI, they both should have their own values, but not to kind of replace each other. And at some point in time,
Right.
generative arts might still be there, because the big companies, they're still gonna try to utilize an AI generated,
Yes.
because that's gonna take less money for them to produce, and they can produce more ads in a short time of span. So that will also not gonna get diminished, but we definitely have to draw a balance. And I think,
Right.
in fact, we also need to think about the audit and compliance guardrails, similar to what we have seen in the other industries. And hopefully, all these creative forums, all these voices that been raised on social media about against the creative arts will eventually do some fruitful. But you can, till the time, you can still enjoy those AI generated reels and arts in your leisure time, because at the end of the day, those will also require, and sometimes the society will also start giving value to them. They'll be built for some different purpose, not for the purpose to replace the human generated art. So I think we're gonna just
Right.
end this conversation in that fashion. And this is a really great conversation, Andres. I really wanted to know from you that, how our listeners could continue this conversation with you, because I'm pretty sure you have a lot of knowledge around it. And the way you mentioned about the future, like in 5 years, 10 years from now, I mean, we could see like a human generated arts could take precedence over AI generated arts. I'm pretty sure my listeners would love to get in touch with you and continue the conversation. So where can they find you? If you just share some of your details, so they will get in touch with you in future.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. So the website for me and what I do is at redmage.cc. Basically, that's where I've kind of compiled a lot of what I do from a business perspective. I'm on LinkedIn, surprisingly, still, as some miracle. So you can find me on LinkedIn if you're interested in connecting. Contra, Contra. It is a sort of freelance platform for creatives that also includes a lot of my portfolio work. If you're interested in kind of seeing what that looks like, or potentially joining me on that platform and kind of being a part of that creative community, I'd really encourage people to hop on there as well. Really, for that, you know, especially with a lot of the work, I don't necessarily want to go and put on my RMAG hat, so to speak, but I would encourage you to go and seek out more community events and stuff like the Rocky Mountain AI Interest Group. You can find it, Fort Collins AI on Meetup, and Rocky Mountain AI on Meetup as well. I would encourage you to find more community events that are trying to talk about this type of thing. And also, if you don't see something that about the type of conversation you're trying to have about AI, consider making it yourself, right? Going back to the idea of creation, I think there's, would say maybe 95 to 90% of the conversation, 99% of the conversation about AI is about either business or engineering. How do we save time? How do we save money? How do we go and do these things while maintaining those standards? There's so much space in the AI space to have conversations about this type of thing, about how technology affects people. And I would encourage you to either find communities that support these types of conversations, like the Rocky Mountain AI Interest Group or Fort Collins AI, or better yet, there's nothing saying you can't start that conversation yourself.
Thanks, Andres. I think our listeners will definitely took some notes about how they can start their AI journey. Doesn't matter where you are at your AI journey, there'll always be someone who can be a partner with you, some community that you can be a part of. So please follow that. And those of you who are actually live in the Denver and the surrounding areas, feel free to follow Andres Morales, as he's kind of a member of the Rocky Mountain AI Interest Group. And he's also doing a lot of good work for the community in the Denver, Colorado, and even, Fort Collins area. So thanks, Andres. And for everyone listening, whether you're a creative professionals, a technologist, or just someone trying to make sense of where we are headed, I hope this conversation gave you some frameworks to think through these issues, especially who are in the AI and creative space. Just remember that we are writing that story right now, and we all of us are accountable to take the story forward. If this conversation resonated with your thought process, please share it, leave us a review, let us know about what you think. And if you're wrestling with these questions in your own work, I would love to hear from you. And please feel free to get in touch with Andres so he can guide you further on this one. Until next
Yeah.
week, I'm Sam. This is Data Science with Sam's another episode. And the parting comment from my end is keep creating, keep questioning, keep building the future as we actually, which we want to live in, especially in this AI world. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. That